Wood cracked in the dark, window frames groaned, ice crept up the inside of bedroom walls. That was how the winter of 1877 was suffocating Frostbone Ridge. The wind didn't just howl, it hunted. It clawed through every gap in the expensive timber houses. The entire town was fighting a desperate battle to keep the cold from swallowing them alive. Yet, on a barren hillside southeast of town, there was only silence. The surface of the hill was completely buried under drifting snow. Only a thin, nearly invisible ribbon of smoke drifted up through the whiteout. Hidden deep beneath that massive snowpack stood a low wooden door, and behind that door, Samuel Calder slept. No roaring fire, no expensive stove, only the steady warmth of the earth, and a sleeping dog named Cinder. While Frostbone Ridge fought a desperate battle for survival, the man beneath the hill slept soundly through the coldest nights of the century. At that moment, no one in town understood why the safest place in the territory was a hole hidden underground. 8 months earlier, Samuel Calder had lived in a proper wooden cabin beside the northern freight road. It had straight walls, a shingled roof, a cast-iron stove in the center room. People called it a good house. Then winter came. Cold air slipped through cracks too small to see. His young son coughed for 3 nights beside a glowing stove that never seemed able to warm the room. By the 4th morning, the boy's fever had won. Spring took the rest. His wife never truly recovered. When the thaw arrived, she was gone too. After the debts were paid and the cabin abandoned, Sam was left with $12, a dog named Cinder, and a hard lesson. A house could look strong. That did not mean it could keep a family alive. By early spring, Samuel Calder had stopped looking for another cabin. He could not afford one. On the southeastern edge of Frostbone Ridge stood a barren hillside that settlers had ignored for years. The slope was rocky. The wind never seemed to leave it. Almost nothing grew there except stubborn grass and scattered brush. That was precisely why Sam kept returning. One bitter morning, while he was measuring the slope with nothing more than his eyes, Cinder wandered uphill and began digging. At first, Sam paid little attention. The dog dug at one spot for several minutes. Sam called him away. Cinder obeyed. Then he went back. 10 minutes later, he was digging again. The same place, the same patch of frozen ground. By midday, Sam finally climbed the hill and grabbed the dog's collar. Before leading him away, he knelt beside the hole and pressed his bare hand against the exposed soil. Something felt wrong, or perhaps right. The surface was frozen hard enough to crack a shovel blade. But beneath it, the earth felt different. Not warm exactly, just less cold. There was a faint smell too. Dry earth. Deep earth. For a long moment, Sam stayed there without moving. Then an old memory surfaced. Years earlier, he had shared a work camp with a retired railroad tunnel digger. The old man had spent half his life underground cutting passages through mountains. One evening beside a fire, the man had said something Sam never forgot. Winter only kills what's foolish enough to stand exposed. Looking at the hole Cinder had opened, Sam felt the words settle differently than they ever had before. For the first time, the barren hill no longer looked dead. It looked useful. The next morning, Sam spent part of his remaining money. A used shovel with a worn handle, a chipped pickaxe. When the purchases were finished, he counted the coins left in his pocket and felt the weight of how little remained. Then he carried the tools to the hill and began digging straight into the slope. News traveled fast in Frostbone Ridge. By the 3rd day, most of the town had already heard about the man carving a hole into a frozen hillside. That day, when Sam returned to the store for a few more supplies, Elias Crow, the wealthiest supply merchant in the valley, laughed first. The laughter rolled across the warehouse floor. Digging a wolf den, Calder? Several men joined in. Sam ignored them and kept loading supplies into his wagon. Mason Pike, the most respected cabin builder in Frostbone Ridge, watched from near the warehouse stove. "The spring thaw will bring that whole thing down on your head," he said. "Earth moves. Snowmelt moves faster." Near the doorway, Reverend Silas Morrow shook his head. "A man belongs beneath the sky God gave him," he said. "Living underground isn't fit for decent people." Sam never answered any of them. He paid for a coil of rope, picked up a torn wagon tarp nobody else wanted, whistled once for Cinder, and left. That evening, long after the laughter had faded from town, the sound of metal striking earth still echoed across the hillside. One swing, then another, then another. The frozen hill did not care what Frostbone Ridge thought, and Sam had begun to learn the same habit. Every morning began the same way. Darkness, cold, a shovel. By sunrise, Sam Calder was already on the hillside. The upper layer fought him every day. Frozen earth rang beneath the shovel blade like weak stone. More than once, the impact sent painful shocks through his arms. But a few feet deeper, the ground changed. The soil became softer, drier, more stable. It was as if winter ruled the surface, but could not fully reach what lay below. So Sam kept digging. Hour after hour, day after day. The work stripped away everything that wasn't necessary. His hands split open. Blood stained the shovel handle and dried dark across the wood. The skin hardened into calluses. Then those calluses cracked too. His shoulders ached constantly. Some evenings the pain became so sharp that he wrapped rope around his wrists, just to keep his grip from failing. Yet the hollow grew, slowly, relentlessly. By the second week, the excavation was deep enough to block most of the wind. By the third, it had become a real chamber. Roughly 11 feet wide, 15 feet deep. The ceiling curved low instead of rising high. Sam had learned from freight sheds and root cellars that heat preferred staying close. High ceilings impressed visitors. Low ceilings kept people alive. Every night, Cinder lay near the entrance, never far. Sometimes the dog lifted his head at distant sounds carried across the prairie. Other times he simply watched the darkness beyond the opening while Sam worked by lantern light. The hill remained silent. The town remained skeptical. Neither changed his routine. Then one evening, as the sun disappeared behind the western ridges, Sam stepped inside the unfinished chamber and stopped. For the first time, the wind could not reach him. Outside, the prairie air still howled across Frostbone Ridge. Inside, there was only stillness, only earth, only silence. He stood there for several long seconds, listening to nothing at all. And after months of carrying loss from one day into the next, that silence felt almost like shelter. Near the end of the fourth week, Mason Pike appeared at the hillside with a small wagon of scrap lumber. Not enough to build a cabin, enough to build a shack, enough to keep a man off the ground. At least, that was how Mason saw it. He dropped the boards beside the entrance and studied the growing chamber carved into the hill. "You're making a mistake, Calder." Sam rested both hands on the shovel handle but said nothing. Mason pointed toward the ceiling. "Earth collapses. Then toward the damp soil near the entrance. Moisture gets into everything. Then toward the prairie where winter clouds were gathering far beyond the horizon. And when snow piles up, that roof's carrying the weight. The concerns were real. That was what made them dangerous." Mason wasn't laughing. He was speaking from a lifetime of building. For a moment, Sam simply listened. Then his eyes settled on something small. A thin stream of cold air was slipping through the front of Mason's heavy coat. The fabric moved slightly each time the wind gusted. Sam nodded toward it. "Do you sleep well in that?" Mason frowned. "In what?" "The wind." For several seconds, neither man spoke. The breeze continued moving through the tiny opening in the coat. Almost invisible, yet impossible to stop once it found a way inside. Mason looked away first. The old builder left the lumber behind and walked back toward town. He still believed the hill would fail, but as he crossed the frozen prairie, he found himself thinking about something he had never paid much attention to before. Not temperature, movement, because wood could stop cold. Sometimes. But stopping moving air was a different battle entirely. The first real problem arrived with the season's first cold rain. For nearly 2 days, gray clouds hung over Frostbone Ridge. The rain never fell hard, it simply lingered. Slow, steady, relentless. At first, Sam thought little of it. Then one evening, a drop of water struck the back of his hand. A few minutes later, another. He looked up. Tiny beads of moisture had begun forming along parts of the ceiling. By morning, the sleeping corner felt damp. The air carried a heavier smell. Wet earth, stale earth. Something had changed. That night, Cinder noticed it first. For weeks, the dog had slept near the rear wall where the temperature stayed most stable. Now he moved. Without hesitation, he carried himself closer to the entrance and curled up beside the doorway. Sam watched quietly. He trusted observations more than opinions, and Cinder rarely changed habits without a reason. The next day, he spent hours studying the problem. He followed the moisture marks across the ceiling. He watched where the water traveled. He knelt outside and examined the slope above the chamber. By afternoon, the answer became clear. Rainwater was collecting near the entrance before slowly finding paths through the surrounding soil. So he went back to work. He dug a drainage trench around the mouth of the cave, then another channel leading downhill. After that, he hauled dry basalt stones from a nearby ridge and built a raised sleeping platform above the damp ground. The labor cost him 3 more exhausting days. But the change was immediate. The floor stayed dry. The air felt cleaner. That evening, Sam rested a hand on the newly laid basalt. For a long moment, he said nothing. The cave had not failed. It had simply revealed a lesson, and like every lesson nature offered, it demanded to be earned before it could be understood. Near the end of October, Sam turned his attention from digging to heat. Shelter alone would not survive a Dakota winter. The shelter had to hold warmth after the fire died. That was the harder problem. One afternoon, he spent nearly 3 hours searching through a rusted scrapyard beyond the freight road. Most of the metal was useless. Broken wagon parts, bent barrels, twisted stove sections. Then he found what he needed: a cracked cast-iron kettle, an abandoned stovepipe, and enough scrap metal to improvise a small heating system. Back at the hill, Sam dug a shallow pit beneath the future stove location. Into it he packed black basalt stones mixed with dry gravel. The stones were dense, heavy, and slow to cool. He had no name for thermal mass. He only knew what experience had taught him. Some materials gave heat quickly. Others kept it. He trusted the second kind. Next, he lowered the floor near the entrance several inches below the sleeping area. Cold air was heavier than warm air. If it entered, he wanted it settling where nobody slept. Behind the door, he hung 2 worn horse blankets salvaged from a freight camp. One barrier stopped wind. 2 barriers trapped warmth. Cinder immediately claimed the spot beside the basalt bed as his own. That night, Sam lit a small fire and waited. Hours later, the flames finally died. The chamber darkened. Silence returned. Yet when he placed his hand on the basalt stones, they were still warm, not hot, not glowing, just quietly holding what the fire had left behind. For the first time, Sam felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in many months: possibility. A few days later, Clara Morrow, the minister's wife and one of the most influential women in town, arrived at the hillside with 2 women from the church. They carried a loaf of bread, an old wool blanket, and expressions that mixed concern with disapproval. Clara studied the low entrance for several seconds. "No man keeps his dignity living underground," she finally said. "People weren't meant to live like burrowing animals." Sam looked at her, then stepped aside. "You can come see it." None of them moved. The dark, low entrance and Cinder's quiet, unblinking stare made them hesitate. Then Clara shook her head. "No, that won't be necessary." A few minutes later they walked back toward town. Sam watched them disappear across the prairie. Then he lowered the horse blankets, sealing the evening wind outside once more. He didn't care about the town's mockery, because he knew the real, unforgiving judge was already on its way. The autumn that followed was almost beautiful enough to be trusted. That alone made old Rafe Bell suspicious. The retired trapper had spent too many years reading weather written across the land itself. He noticed things other people ignored. Crows flew lower than usual. Rabbits abandoned exposed burrows weeks earlier than normal. Thin ice began appearing along water troughs before sunset. Even the dogs around Frostbone Ridge seemed restless. They slept lightly. They woke often. "Something's coming," Rafe said one morning outside the feed store. Most people shrugged and returned to their business. Sam did not. Every spare hour became preparation. He stacked dry cow chips beneath a tarp. He gathered sagebrush roots from the prairie. He cut and stored low willow branches wherever he could find them. The growing fuel pile looked unimpressive. That was exactly why he liked it. Winter rarely cared how impressive something looked. Then another problem appeared. One windy evening, while testing the stove, Sam noticed the draft changing unexpectedly. Most of the smoke rose cleanly through the pipe. Most of it. But when the wind shifted direction, part of the smoke seemed to hesitate. For a moment, it paused. Then it was pushed back down, not much, just a little. But that made it worse. Small problems had a habit of becoming death sentences in winter. Long after midnight, Sam sat awake beside the dying fire. Outside, the wind hissed across the hillside. Inside, he listened closely, as faint wisps of smoke were occasionally forced to reverse direction inside the pipe. The shelter was better than it had been a month earlier, but it still wasn't truly ready, and somewhere beyond the dark horizon, the real winter was already on its way. Then one night, that lingering fear became a real danger. A sudden gust struck the hillside. The draft reversed. Smoke rolled back through the pipe and spread across the chamber ceiling. Within seconds, Cinder scrambled to his feet, shaking his head and fighting for clean air. Sam reacted immediately. He grabbed Cinder by the collar and led him outside into the freezing darkness. Then he sat there, watching, studying, for hours. Not the fire, not the stove, the smoke. By dawn, he understood what the wind was doing. The next day, he returned to the scrapyard and found a curved section of metal. He fitted it onto the upper part of the stovepipe, changing the angle slightly. Then he stacked a low wall of stone several feet away to break the strongest crosswinds before they reached the chimney. That evening, he tested the system again. The fire burned, the wind shifted, the smoke rose cleanly, and kept rising. For the first time, the draft held steady. Later that night, Cinder slept beside the warm basalt stones without coughing once. Sam rested a hand on the dog's neck. Winter was teaching him the same lesson over and over. Wind never stopped looking for a way inside. A man survived by finding that way first. With the shelter finally breathing right, it didn't take long for curiosity to outweigh the town's skepticism. Tom Pike, Mason's son, used a missing mule as an excuse to climb the hillside, though the animal had been found hours earlier. Curiosity pushed the 15-year-old through the low entrance. Inside, he stopped cold. No wind, no drafts, just an even, settled warmth. He knelt and pressed a hand against the basalt bed where Cinder was sleeping. The fire was completely out, yet the rock was still radiating heat. How? Tom asked. Sam looked toward the cold ashes. Making heat matters. Keeping it matters more. Tom sat in the quiet chamber for a long moment, his voice dropping to a whisper. It feels like summer never completely left. Down in the earth, the remnants of summer were carefully preserved. But up on the surface, winter was finally done being patient. The first bitter winds of early winter swept into Frostbone Ridge. Not with a roar, not with destruction, it simply hunted for weaknesses. At night, the wooden walls began to groan. Across town, stored wood piles disappeared at an alarming rate. Every proud symbol of the above-ground world was being tested. Money began to fail. At Elias Crow's house, double the usual amount of wood was burned. The fire roared in the center, but the heat vanished quickly, leaving the distant corners freezing. Experience began to fail. At Mason Pike's house, the most expertly fitted doors couldn't stop the wind from whistling through invisible gaps. Rigid faith began to fail. At Reverend Morrow's house, a north wind pushed back down the chimney, forcing gray smoke to gather beneath the ceiling. The expensive houses were leaking heat like buckets with holes in them. Meanwhile, beneath the hill, Sam burned only a few dried cow chips each night. A small fire, lingering warmth, a system quietly saving every ounce of energy. One freezing morning, Elias Crow stood inside the grandest house in the valley. He pressed his bare hand against the inside of his wooden wall. A biting chill transferred to his skin. A thin layer of ice was forming right there, inside his home, right in his bedroom. And for the first time, Elias felt a crack in his own pride. The cold didn't stop at the wooden walls. It had begun settling deep into the lungs. Adeline Pike, Mason's wife, was the first to seek out the hillside herself. She carried a hacking cough brought on by the drafts in the very cabin her husband had built. She came because Mason stubbornly refused to believe a wolf den could hold heat. She ducked through the low entrance, and almost immediately, she wanted to cry. The steady, quiet, warm air wrapped around her shivering body. Her cough eased after only a few breaths. Adeline sat down on the lowered floor, next to the basalt stones that still radiated heat. Cinder walked over and gently rested his shaggy head on her leg. Sam stood quietly nearby, offering no boasts. She looked at the plastered earth walls, the wind-blocking blankets, the stones. "This place doesn't fight winter," she said, her voice cracking with relief. "It refuses to let winter inside." Mason might have been the expert on wood, but right then, Adeline knew her husband was wrong. For the first time after weeks of sleepless, freezing nights, she closed her eyes, leaned against the earthen wall, and truly rested. December 18th, 1877, arrived wearing the kind of beauty that made experienced men nervous. The morning sky carried a strange yellow-gray color. Across Frostbone Ridge, the wind vanished, completely. No rattling shutters, no movement in the grass. The silence felt heavier than noise. Old Rafe Bell noticed it immediately. The old trapper spent the morning securing every shutter on his cabin. When a neighbor asked what he was expecting, Rafe looked toward the horizon and answered without humor, "This cold's going to bite through bone." Meanwhile, Cinder refused to settle down. The dog paced constantly, from the entrance, to the rear wall, back to the entrance again. Every few minutes he stopped, listening to something nobody else could hear. Sam watched without interrupting. Animals often noticed danger before men did. By noon, even the birds had disappeared. The sky darkened another shade. Still no wind, still no snow, only waiting. Then the first gust arrived, hard enough to throw loose powder across the hillside. Another followed. Then another. Within an hour, the prairie had vanished behind moving curtains of white. Snow no longer drifted downward. It traveled sideways. Fast. Violent. Like white sand driven by a giant whip. The white-knuckle blizzard had arrived, and for the first time since digging into the hill, Sam understood that every decision he had made was about to be tested. As daylight faded, Cinder stopped pacing. The dog walked to the entrance and scratched lightly at the earth beside the doorway. Once, twice. Then he settled near the deeper part of the chamber. Sam watched him for several seconds. The gesture felt strangely familiar, almost like a reminder. The storm was above, the answer was below. The first night of the white-knuckle blizzard didn't just expose weaknesses, it crushed them. Above ground, the battle was no longer about staying comfortable. It was about staying alive. Elias Crow's pride had entirely given way to terror. The wind howled so violently that the shifting wooden beams sounded like snapping bones. Every frantic attempt to stuff more fuel into the stove was useless. The heat was swallowed instantly. At the Pike House, Adeline's cough had turned into a suffocating rattle. Mason's expertly built cabin now felt like an ice cage trapping them inside. But the true peak of desperation was at Reverend Morrow's house. The children's crying had long since faded into a terrifying lethargy. Clara Morrow held her youngest daughter practically against the glowing stove, yet it wasn't enough to fight off the freezing drafts. When she frantically pulled back the edge of the blanket, her heart stopped. The tips of the little girl's toes had turned pale blue. Death had crossed the threshold. Meanwhile, beneath the frozen hill, the cave remained perfectly still. No screaming wind, no panic. The temperature hovered steadily near 55 degrees. The basalt stones continued to radiate warmth from the earlier fire. Sam fed the stove only twice that night, no more. Cinder slept soundly beside the thermal bed, his breathing slow and peaceful. In the quiet darkness, Sam rested his hand on the warm stone platform, and despite the worst storm of the decade raging overhead, he found himself remembering another winter, another small hand, one that had grown cold beside a stove that burned all night inside a proper house. By the third night, the line of human endurance finally snapped. Inside his freezing cabin, Mason Pike frantically rubbed Adeline's icy hands. He stared at the dead stove and choked out the words he had resisted for months. Sam Calder was right. The admission tasted bitter, but it was the truth. Across town, Elias Crow stood motionless in the dark of the largest house in the valley. The last piece of firewood was gone. For the first time in his life, the wealthy merchant realized his mansion wasn't a fortress. It was an expensive wooden box waiting to become a tomb. Pride was dead. Money, experience, and prayers were now as useless as the snow outside. In their darkest hour, the minds of Frostbone Ridge all turned to the same place. They remembered the thin, peaceful ribbon of smoke rising from the barren hill. They remembered the man with $12 and a dog, and they knew, if they wanted their families to survive the night, there was only one choice left. The storm weakened only briefly, a few precious hours, no more. For the first time in days, shapes could be seen beyond the blowing snow. That was enough. 3 separate groups left Frostbone Ridge and climbed toward the hillside. Elias Crow carried his young grandson in his arms. Mason Pike supported Adeline with one hand while fighting the wind with the other. Reverend Morrow walked behind them, holding a child wrapped tightly in blankets against his chest. No one spoke much. The climb took more strength than it should have. Snow reached their knees in places. The cold cut through layers of wool and leather. Above them, a thin ribbon of smoke drifted into the gray sky. They followed it. At last, they reached the low entrance they had mocked for months. The wolf den, the burrow, the hole in the ground. Now it stood between them and disaster. Cinder sat beside the doorway, silent, watching. Seconds stretched in the cold air. At last, Elias stepped forward. His voice sounded smaller than usual. "If you don't let us in," he said, glancing toward the child in Reverend Morrow's arms, "that little girl won't survive another night." The wind hissed across the hillside. Behind the snow-covered door, warmth waited. and every person standing there knew it. Sam Calder could have refused. The memory was still there. The laughter inside the warehouse, the jokes about wolf dens. Every word had survived the storm just as clearly as the people standing outside his door. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Sam looked past Elias Crow, Mason Pike, Reverend Morrow. His eyes settled on the child wrapped in blankets. The girl's lips had lost their color. That decided the matter. Sam stepped aside and pulled the door open wider. "Keep your heads low when you come in," he said. "The warm air stays lower than most people think." One by one, they entered. The adults crouched instinctively beneath the low ceiling. The children were placed closest to the basalt thermal bed. The sick sat nearest the remaining warmth. The stronger men settled along the outer edges. Soon the chamber filled with the sound of breathing. No apologies, no victory, just people trying to stay alive. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The basalt continued releasing stored warmth. Little by little, color returned to frozen faces. Then Clara Morrow looked down at the child resting against her shoulder. The girl flexed her toes beneath the blankets. For the first time in days, a small movement, barely noticeable. Yet Clara saw it immediately. So did everyone else. She lowered her head and closed her eyes. No words came out. Only tears. For 4 nights, the cave became a world of its own. Outside, the white-knuckle blizzard continued battering Frostbone Ridge. Inside, life settled into a rhythm. Sam rose at nearly the same hours each day. He checked the stovepipe. He inspected the entrance. He fed the fire small amounts of fuel at measured intervals, never wasting heat and never allowing the chamber to cool too far. Mason Pike spent most of his time observing how basalt stones absorbed warmth and released heat long after the fire had gone out. Most of all, he watched what did not happen. The temperature never crashed. The room never filled with smoke. The walls never dripped with moisture. The system simply worked. Across the chamber, Elias Crow found himself staring at the small fire again and again. Back home, he would have burned 3 times as much fuel for half the comfort. The realization humbled him more effectively than any argument ever could. Near the rear wall, Clara Morrow barely slept the first night. Not because of fear, because she kept checking on the little girl. Each time she reached over, she found the child sleeping peacefully, warm, breathing steadily. By the second night, Clara finally slept too. No one spoke loudly anymore. The cave seemed to discourage it. Voices lowered naturally. People moved carefully. Even the children became quieter. The earth absorbed much of the sound just as it absorbed the fury of the wind above. Late on the 4th evening, Mason placed a hand against the packed earth wall. The surface felt solid, steady, dependable. He stood there for several moments before speaking. "I spent my whole life building houses to fight winter." His eyes moved slowly across the chamber, then toward Sam. "And you built a place winter can't get into." No one answered. None was needed. The storm outside was still making its argument. The cave had already made its own. The white-knuckle blizzard did not end all at once. It weakened, then retreated, slowly, like a predator reluctantly abandoning a fight. On the morning the sky finally cleared, the people inside the cave stepped back into daylight for the first time in days. The valley looked unfamiliar. Drifts swallowed fences. Roads had vanished completely. Snow covered the prairie in every direction. Nature had finished its inspection. Now came the verdict. Elias Crow reached his property first. Part of the horse barn had collapsed beneath the weight of wind-packed snow. Several support beams had snapped. One side of the roof sagged inward like a broken rib. The large house still stood, but standing and winning were not the same thing. The windows carried long cracks across the glass. Frost still clung to interior corners that should never have frozen. Farther down the valley, Reverend Morrow found one section of his roof bowed under the accumulated weight. At Mason Pike's cabin, ice covered part of an interior wall. Not outside, inside. The sight disturbed him more than any storm damage. For years he had trusted those walls. Now they had betrayed him. Meanwhile, the hillside looked almost untouched. The cave did not rise above the landscape. It disappeared into it. Only a thin ribbon of smoke drifted upward into the cold morning air. The roof remained buried beneath snow. The earth had accepted the storm instead of fighting it. Cinder bounded across the drifts with effortless energy, leaving fresh tracks behind him. Against the endless white landscape, the prints stretched from the cave entrance and disappeared into the sunlight. Elias stood quietly near the hill. For a long time, he stared at the frozen earth above the chamber, the same earth he had mocked, the same earth that had protected everyone when his own house could not. He reached out and placed a gloved hand against the snow-covered roof. An apology tried to form. It never made it past his throat. No words seemed large enough. The hillside required none. Its survival was already speaking for itself. 2 weeks after the storm, Mason Pike walked back up the hillside carrying a notebook. The old builder stopped outside the entrance and stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "I know how to build walls," he said. Then he held up the notebook. "But I want to learn how to keep heat." There was no bitterness left in his voice, only honesty. Sam nodded once and invited him inside. Over the following days, the notebook began to fill. Not with complicated formulas or grand theories, with practical observations. Things the storm had proven. Sam showed him the basalt thermal bed and explained why some materials stored warmth long after a fire burned out. He demonstrated how a low roof trapped heat more effectively than a high one. He pointed to the drainage channels outside and explained how moisture slowly destroyed comfort long before it destroyed a structure. Then he walked Mason beyond the entrance and showed him the low stone windbreak protecting the stovepipe. "The wind isn't the enemy," Sam said. "It just follows openings." Mason wrote that down too. Word spread. Before spring arrived, several families began building partially buried shelters of their own. Some dug storage rooms into hillsides. Others added earth berms against exposed walls. A few copied Sam's drainage trenches almost exactly. The changes looked small at first, but they marked the beginning of something larger. Frostbone Ridge was no longer building against winter the same way it always had. It was learning from it. Late one afternoon, Mason sat outside the cave reviewing his notes. He turned to the first page and read the opening sentence he had written weeks earlier. Then he underlined it. Once. Slowly. The words had become more valuable than any blueprint he had ever owned. Wind always finds a path. Don't give it one. Many years passed. The hill remained. So did the lessons buried inside it. By then, Frostbone Ridge looked different than it once had. Here and there, green earth-covered roofs appeared along the valley. Some shelters were built into slopes. Others used bermed walls and buried storage rooms. Drainage trenches became common. Windbreaks appeared beside cabins that had once stood exposed. Winter still came every year, but it no longer collected lives the way it once had. Children grew up knowing things their parents had learned too late, and much of that knowledge could be traced back to a quiet man and a hillside nobody wanted. Sam Calder grew old there. So did Cinder. The dog that had once clawed through frozen soil eventually moved more slowly. The gray around his muzzle spread year after year. His walks became shorter. His naps became longer. Yet whenever snow covered the valley, Cinder still liked resting near the entrance where everything had begun. One winter morning, he did not wake up. There was no struggle, no suffering, only stillness, the same kind of stillness that had filled the cave on the first evening Sam discovered the wind could no longer reach him. That afternoon, Sam carried the old dog outside. The ground near the entrance was frozen, but not as deeply as the surrounding prairie. He dug there anyway. The place felt right. Years earlier, Cinder's paws had scratched at that exact hillside while everyone else saw nothing but frozen dirt. Sam buried him where the first hole had appeared, where the story had started. The seasons continued moving forward. Children who had not even been born during the white-knuckle blizzard eventually played on the grassy roof above the cave. They ran across it without realizing they were standing on one of the most important shelters in the valley's history. Sometimes they asked why the hill had a door. Older residents always smiled before answering. By then, the story belonged to the community as much as it belonged to Sam. On cold evenings, people still noticed the same thin ribbon of smoke rising into the winter sky. A small thing, easy to miss, yet somehow reassuring. Late in his life, Sam often sat outside the entrance watching that smoke drift upward. The years had taught him something important. The earth had never promised safety. The wind had never promised mercy. Winter had never promised fairness. Nature made no bargains. It offered no special treatment. What it offered instead were rules. Simple rules. Unchanging rules. The people who learned them survived. The people who ignored them paid the price. One snowy evening, Sam placed a weathered hand on the patch of ground where Cinder rested. The valley was quiet. The smoke drifted upward. The hill stood exactly where it always had. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then a faint smile touched his face. "You heard the warmth before I did." The wind moved softly across Frostbone Ridge. The earth kept its silence, and beneath the old hill, The lesson remained exactly where it had always been, waiting for the next person willing to listen.